Hello and welcome to another screencast. This time it's about altitude and altitude training. These concepts will discover or help you to discover what happens when we train at altitude, and within the lesson we'll be thinking about why athletes train at altitude and why they do this to enhance performance in minor ways. So first thing you need to realise is that when we talk about altitude, that means 1500 metres above sea level, and that's what's classified as high altitude. Now within the lesson this week I will show you some different altitude heights to give you an example of this, but what we generally say is anything above 1500 metres classifies as high altitude. And what happens when you have high altitude is that the pressure of oxygen starts to become reduced. So what we call the PPO2, if you remember from the dissociation curve, it becomes very much reduced. There's less oxygen in the air. And this has a massive knock-on effect in terms of how much oxygen you can get into your lungs. So if we reduce the pressure of oxygen in the air, it also means the pressure of oxygen reduces in your lungs and down to your alveoli. And when the partial pressure of oxygen is reduced in your alveoli, that means we get what's called hypoxia, or a state of hypoxia. It just means we're gasping for breath. There isn't quite enough oxygen for us to move the muscle groups. Now what happens within the body is the body gets alerted by this decrease of pressure and oxygen, and it adapts. In fact, it increases a chemical called EPO, which is erythropoietin, and what that actually does, EPO, is that it stimulates the increase in red blood cell production. So it starts to produce more and more red blood cells to compensate for this lack of pressure in your alveoli. And that means a faster capillarization, or an increase in capillarization rate. So as you can see, there's like a chain of events that happens when you start to work or train at altitude, or even move around at altitude. And I'm going to walk through this because this is a good way of showing you the step-by-step process of what happens, and will be good answers for exam questions if you get a question such as what are the effects of altitude on the body or the respiratory system. So if we start at the top, essentially the effect of altitude is, as we discussed just a minute ago, you get a decrease of partial pressure, PP, of oxygen in your alveoli, in the base of your lungs, and that gives you that state of hypoxia. The decreased partial pressure of oxygen means a reduction in the diffusion gradient. Now, in a nutshell, what that means is that curve that we drew last week on the graph shifts to the right. So if you remember, the partial pressure of oxygen on the diffusion curve is 100 partial pressure of oxygen, 100 millimeters of mercury, and if you remember drawing the 100, when it shifts to the right it slightly decreases. Well, actually what happens is there's a little bit more of a decrease in the lungs, which means there's less oxygen being associated, which comes on to the fourth point on this, because you get less hemoglobin association during external respiration, which is the bit in your alveoli, the bit in your lungs, and a decrease in oxygen. So you get this gasping effect because there's not enough oxygen coming into your alveoli for us to use and utilise around the body. The fifth point on this wheel says that the result of that decrease in oxygen means obviously there's a decrease in oxygen transport in the blood. Not enough oxygen in your alveoli means we can't get enough oxygen within the blood to be transported around the body, which then moves on to the next step, which means there's not enough oxygen to the working muscles. Ultimately, what that then implies is there's a decrease in your VO2 max, which is the volume of oxygen you can uptake during exercise, and your aerobic capacity levels will reduce. So for athletes, this is a major effect. It means you can't run as long as you could do at sea level, and as I say, you start gasping, getting that hypoxic effect. Your muscles will become tired a lot quicker. Therefore, this brings on fatigue quicker. So as I just said, you'll get tired very quickly, and OBLA, the onset of blood lactic accumulation, will start to happen faster, because if you think about sprinting at sea level, so where we are at the moment, Brighton, you might be able to sprint for up to about 2 minutes before your muscles will get cramp. Now, because we haven't got any oxygen in the air, what will now happen is your 2-minute window until you get cramp will be reduced significantly. It could be up to 1 minute before you start to get cramp, because there's not enough oxygen to remove those lactic acid levels, and therefore your overall performance will reduce at altitude. Now, the other effects of altitude that you get when you start to look at working above 1500 meters is there is a long-term effect, if we look on the left-hand side, of a decreased partial pressure of oxygen. And what that does is, as you train more and more at altitude, you get even more increased hemoglobin, HB, and your red blood cell production will increase dramatically, so RBC, the more and more you stay at that altitude level. The problem we have is that obviously, because we can't get enough oxygen in, it can't attach to that hemoglobin or the red blood cell, so it's a kind of contradiction in a way. The second effect is that the colder air at altitude level, so if you think about going snowboarding or skiing up in the Alps, it's much, much colder air, and what that does is it increases the water loss, and the air starts to moisten in the lungs, and you get a very, very quick dehydration effect. So you will need water very quickly. Again, going back to skiing or snowboarding, they always tell you to rehydrate a lot of the time when you ski or snowboard if you're going down high mountains or a high altitude, simply because the colder air is losing water from your body quite quickly. The last thing that happens is that, if you remember, with the RCC we rely on our chemoreceptors to detect a change in carbon dioxide levels so we can start the breathing process. Well, what happens here is, because of altitude, you get a decrease in muscle oxygen chemoreceptors. That means the chemoreceptors are being reduced, and what happens there is, because they're being reduced, the body is shocked into thinking, Christ, we need to increase our breathing rate, because the chemoreceptors are telling us that there's less oxygen in the air, and the breathing rate will actually increase quite quickly. Okay, as with all of the screencasts here, you need to re-go over all of this stuff and make good notes and bring to the lesson.